Chapter 1. The Kid. Cassandra's bed has a humble wooden frame made from the soft brown wood of the outer forest. She lay nestled beneath a threadbare quilt, painstakingly stitched together from old fabric scraps. Despite its worn appearance, the bedding was perfectly warm and comforting, cocooning her in a swath of faded colors. The sole arm that poked out from within felt the chill upon the morning air in her room, and she pulled it to her chest after a small shiver. Far above, the red and orange clouds began to thin, and the final patter of rain fell upon the roof and dripped down upon the ground, swallowed up as though the dirt were the sands of a desert. Within her room, a rickety wooden bookshelf leaned against one wall, its shelves illuminated by the dancing flame of a single candle, which sat upon an uneven bedside table. The shelves were mostly empty, except for a thin layer of dust, a few cobwebs, and a bowl which contained the remains of a fat little fish she hadn't bothered to name. It had died yesterday, though its passing won't be of any great concern. It had lived a good life and died with a full stomach. Why, it would still have had children had it not eaten them as they were born. Tomorrow, she will take it out into the forest and offer it to the beetles as a show of thanks. A tiny gesture, considering the fact that she will ignore their warning. Her room would be an uncomfortable space, were Cassandra a bit older and a few inches taller. It was certainly small, with no space for even a window. Still, it kept out the constant hum of the fence that surrounded the property and the cries of any creature unfortunate enough to walk into it. On the opposite side of the room was a wooden desk, which bore the mark of countless ink stains and surrounded by scattered parchment. Her handwriting skills would never be considered an art form, but with time and a little patience with herself, she could both read and write. To be sure, there were words she does not know, nor would she recognize. But for a 9-year-old, she would like to think that most would see her as clever, if not above average, for never having any formal education. The floor was scuffed with countless signs of wear, set against rows of uneven tan wooden planks and beneath a worn-out rug that had seen better days. It was the one item in her room she would always keep clean, as her father had once exploded into anger when he found it caked with mud. She wasn't one to neglect her responsibilities. However, the night before had been difficult. Her muscles ached from her run home through the forest, and she had fallen into bed with the intention of only taking a rest, but she was swiftly carried off to sleep. She knew she had left a long, grimy trail of mud leading from the front door, and her bed sheets would take hours to clean. But that old rug seemed to be the only thing that bothered anyone. Her mother, Catherine, would often step in should Weslow start yelling aggressively, but this time she just silently observed. It was her way of agreeing with him, and she hated it, but she knew it must have been important to the both of them. It was a simple mistake that ended with more than she cared to go through, so for everyone's sake, it was kept spotless. She would care more for it, as she loved the strange pattern of intricate designs that were long faded from years of use, but the overall color reminded her of bright red tomatoes, which had been on her shit list since before she could remember. Cassandra groans and turns over in bed. The sound of earthenware shattering and muffled yelling hardly permeated the thick wooden walls. It had become a familiar backdrop to her unconscious state, like the crackling of logs over a fire in winter, or the incessant patter of rain crashing upon the roof of her small cottage. It was not enough to pull her out of her warm and simple dreams. As far as she was concerned, the earliest moments of the morning centered on having a fuzzy, brown little bear for a pet. It shook its fur, tossing mud all across the previously immaculate living room, and jumped all over the furniture, leaving deep, thin gashes in the material. Her parents seemed to be away, and so she chased the bear about, pleading for it to desist in its mayhem, while her arms waved madly in the air. Before the chaos of the next room could fully register, Cassandra's thoughts were of how silly she was behaving towards a very friendly beast. It was a foolish representation of herself, and she felt immediately annoyed, her face stitching itself into a frown, as she observed the landscape of her dream. But the space around her melts away as finally, the real world begins to sink in. She can hear the muffled sound of her father yelling in furious outbursts, and her mother screaming. Cassandra throws off the layers of patchwork that make up her sheets and runs into the adjacent room. The living room was in ruins, with 3 plates of that morning's breakfast smashed upon the ground, and a chair now sitting in pieces. The fireplace had gone out, and through clenched teeth she could see the wisps of her breath turning to mist. She looked at the door, but it's shut. She knew it would never budge, as it was crafted from a wood that was nearly as hard as stone. But still, the house trembled as her father raged against whatever drunken irritation possessed him today. In most instances, Catherine would pull Weslow away, giving Cassandra time to go elsewhere of her own accord. The heavy doors became the armor her mother used to protect her, until he eventually calms. But today, Cassandra has had enough. She rapidly pounds her small fist against the door and screams for Catherine, who can be heard sobbing. Time dragged on as Weslow slowly opened the door, but before she could spot her mother through the upturned furniture, fallen books, and smashed artwork, Weslow pushed her to the ground. The look on his face as he stared down upon her took the fight out of Cassandra, and her voice caught in her throat. She wouldn't look away, but his rage seemed so out of control that his red and watery eyes reflected the smoldering embers of the fire that had lit the living room. "Get out," he says coldly, his tone flat and emotionless. He grabs her by the collar of her shirt, his grip unrelenting as she attempted to struggle free. Pulling her across the room, he opens the front door and tosses her out like a disobedient pet onto the cold and dry morning dirt. A small gathering of debris broke the worst of her landing, but she still fell hard and rolled side over side for several meters. After coming to a stop, she slams her balled-up fists against the ground in frustration, but only once. Cassandra picked herself up, her knees scraped and her heart pounding in her chest. With a grimace plastered across her face, she dusted herself off as best she could. The cold, dry dirt would work well enough to stop the tiny spots of blood that began to pool over the broken skin of her knees. Unlike a certain friend of hers, she had no skill for the tricks that could cast off filth or how to tell directions with nothing but a feather, or even the skills of her friend Yeslin, who was slow to learn most things but excelled at mixing herbs. The sort that could accelerate the rate at which small wounds heal would be a useful one to pick up, and she reminds herself to ask about it when she sees her next. The sky was a dull, ashen gray, which cast its gloom over the clearing around her home. At times, the rain would trigger the translucent gates that kept out the wild, causing the snap of energy to ring through the otherwise silent surroundings. But it now resumed its steady and unnerving hum. The weather perfectly complemented her mood, and she found herself feeling thankful the rains had passed by the time she made her grand arrival out into the world. No more than a few patches of grass grew so close to her house, their muddy brown leaves covered in purple spines, which tirelessly sought to rip and infect whatever should pass too close. And so Cassandra liked to think that her father poisoned the very ground with his presence. She looks up to her home, its dark blue wooden walls standing tall and imposing, while she could do nothing but shake her head to clear her thoughts. Today was just another addition to the list of crappy starts to what is usually a pretty good day. The sounds of earthenware containers shattering and furniture being destroyed were going to continue, but the house would never let the sounds escape. She knew she had seen little in that brief moment through the open door, but it had told her everything she needed to know. Her small fists trembled with anger as she thought of her mother, trapped in that kind of tempest. Weslow's face, contorted with fury, was etched into her memory, but her mother would endure, as long as Cassandra left and stayed out of the way. She knew he couldn't hurt her if she stood up to him. Her friends had told her all about the way he gets. He stumbles into the slums, already reeking of alcohol, then continues from bar to bar until he starts a fight, eventually getting beaten and thrown into one of the hundreds of alleyways. Possibly, the only positive thing anyone had ever said about him was that he somehow managed to live so long. But Cassandra was not convinced anyone ever meant it as a good thing. Long stacks of blue logs made up her home, with wood that was impossible to harvest unless naturally fallen. While en route, they were as hard as stone. Nearly as hard as stone meant that getting back inside would never work. It left a sickening feeling in her stomach, But if she remained there, she would only risk getting the worst of Weslow's anger. She walks to the back of her home, her bare feet atop the cold-packed earth sending shivers up her spine. But fortunately or not, this wasn't the first morning of its kind, and Cassandra was ready. There were never any natural sounds this close to her home. The massive trees prevented any substantial breeze from passing through, and even the insects seemed to avoid the large clearing of their property. No birds with their morning song ever greeted Cassandra's arrival, but at the least, there would be plenty once she got closer to the forest. The rear of her home would seem as barren as the rest, were it not for the overgrown remains of ancient farming equipment. Wheels and blades, all taken by rust and decay, rose from the ground in protest of their final resting place, while the tiny bits of silver that remained reflected the light that rose upon the morning. After moving a few carefully placed stones, she gathers a small pack of clothes from a box, wrapped in a brown scrap of fabric, and removes a small blue knife found several weeks ago as she traveled through the forest. Both the handle and blade were made of wood, though it had the weight and feel of stone. Despite having no reason to test it on more than a few scraps of fabric, she was certain that it was sharp enough to use as a weapon. She stares at it darkly, remembering her mother making her swear to never harm Weslow, even though she thinks it would be pretty easy to catch him unaware to end both their problems at once. She made the promise with blood, but it was what it took for Cassandra to begin her training, and she would never betray her mother's trust. The tiny scar on her thumb reminded her of that much. But still, you grow stronger every day, Catherine would say, and Cassandra knew it wouldn't be long before she would put a stop to her father's nonsense. Deciding to focus on getting through the forest, she takes the knife and cuts a strip of cloth from her pack. She takes a few small blue leaves and wraps them around the wooden blade, their leathery toughness making them a suitable sheath. She had to use every resource available to her, and so her clothes were also made from the forest leaves. Layers of them sewn together and treated in oils would retain their soft and supple nature, and a simple tunic design allowed her plenty of mobility. Her fingers were sore for days after completing the outfit, but it was worth it to stand out less while traveling through God's forest. After slipping into her socks and shoes, she pulled the clothes over top of her nightgown, then used the strip to tie the bundled-up knife just below her left knee before setting out. The cool morning air wrapped around her, casting off any remaining haze from having woken up no more than a few minutes ago. The sky above was now a tapestry of thin gray clouds, moving slowly as the rising sun peeked out over the horizon. It was going to rain again, but for now, the crisp, earthy smell was something to enjoy. Once she gets to the city, it would be very different. Part 2. Blue Trees and Red Vines. The forest seemed welcoming compared to what she had left at home. The massive leaves above provided few patches of dappled sunlight, yet still it danced upon the forest floor, illuminating vibrant mosses and wildflowers that painted the landscape in a riot of colors. She could see the thin, silvery wings of 1,000 dragonflies catching the sun in brief moments of sparkling light. Absorbing it as they flit about, she would often sit and watch as they illuminate at night in a breathtaking display of swirling greens and yellows, meant to showcase their toxicity. With each step deeper into the woods, Cassandra's senses heightened, despite the numbness that was beginning to affect her toes. Her socks and shoes were made of the leaves of the forest, tough, thin, light, supple, and waterproof, but at the sacrifice of warmth. She decided that she would set out for a run to warm up, and she takes off into a steady, though cautious jog. Bits of moss clung to the tiny hairs of the fior leaves that cushioned her soles, but it also helped keep her steps nearly silent. The occasional squeak or rustle of leaves as unseen creatures scurried away helped set her mind to task. Right now, she was the most dangerous creature in this part of the forest, though she knew that wouldn't always be the case. She had learned to navigate the dense woods, modifying her path each time to evade the creatures that called this forest home. She looks to the ground and trees to see evidence of their presence, and finds tiny paw prints reminiscent of mice, and larger web tracks that left deep four-pronged gashes in the earth. Not long ago, something big had passed through. but she couldn't tell what. A sense of unease settled within her at the thought of some new creature stalking about. Though a few larger creatures were docile, she felt short on trust at the moment. Her recent confrontation with Weslow still echoed in her mind, and his eyes, burning red with anger, haunted her thoughts. It was unlike anything she had experienced before, but she had to focus. This wouldn't be the time for a lapse in concentration. She takes several deep breaths and exhales slowly before searching for more signs that may inform her path today. Cassandra knew a few tricks to getting by in the forest, but it took more curiosity than caution to figure them out. Yet, even after years of moving through, there was always something new to discover, for better or worse. The smallest kinds of life seemed like a safe place to start when she first became curious. But she didn't expect that so much of her initial trips would be filled with following the lives of little blue-striped beetles, each about the size of her thumb. She couldn't stand bugs at first, and she'd get upset each time she found them in her hair or clothes. It was the itchy, crawling feeling left by their 200 or more hair-like legs that her senses refused to accept for anything but invasive. But they never seemed interested or bothered enough to bite her. They surely could, for protruding below their 3 sets of glowing green eyes were 2 sharp rows of mandibles. However, it didn't take long for her to find out how they survive. For around 4 days a month, the rain falls nonstop, making traveling through to town impossible. The dense leaves of the treetops create a canopy, which pushes the rain to the edges of the forest, surrounding it in a waterfall. But after the great storms pass, the floodwaters recede, pushing the town's filth and trash into the forest, where it's broken down by creatures such as the little beetles. Each month, they'll eat the garbage or bloated remains of the dead that gets washed in from the city. Within a few days, the beetles strip everything off the dead, leaving nothing but their stark, bleached skeletons behind. At first, it was a sight that churned Cassandra's stomach. Those bones, once part of living, breathing people, now gnawed clean and discarded like so much refuse. The beetles, with their eerie efficiency, reduced the remnants of life to something useful but devoid of humanity. After she learned that human bones could be used for picking locks, she came to appreciate the creepy little things for the role they played in her life. It was difficult for her to stop thinking about who the people might have been when she initially went to gather their bones. The same bones which would be whittled down by some thief's apprentice around her age. But after the first time she treated her friends with some food, that gnawing feeling went away forever. Each snap of bone beneath her hands became less a reminder of death and more a means of survival. It was just a job she had to do to protect what she cared about. No more, no less. Like her mother with Weslow or her friends with her, nothing good came without its penalty. At the very least, she would bury the remains once she had what she needed, but the reddish-brown dirt would stain her hands for days. Yeslin would always give her a lecture about wasting time in that fucked up forest for them whenever she saw her hands the color of dried blood, but today, she was looking forward to it. Getting yelled at by Yeslin was nothing like what happened at home. It felt like a relief. A reminder that they still viciously cared about her, so each month she would collect enough to sell to treat her friends. And as the few dozen bones rattled in her bag from the day before, she was anxious to meet up with them. Living in the center of the Blue Forest had fleeting moments of great peace, but it also cut Cassandra off from the entire world. She had no one she could speak to, no neighbors to visit, and no food stalls to beg or steal from. But most importantly, her friends could never come here. She needed them in her life, so she wouldn't risk them being hurt. What's more is that they cared about her just as much. They didn't act or talk the same way around her as they did with everyone else, and it wasn't just because she had saved their lives. They always made time for her, always wanted to hear about her training at home, the things she discovers in the forest, and to tell her their stories too. One was always in the middle of some silly new problem of gigantic proportions, with Cassandra getting roped in to help. Yet you might be forgiven for thinking that the other brought some manner of caution or maturity to the group, but for the truth of it, 19-year-old Yeslin was in many ways so much worse. A stolen item could be replaced, and sometimes a person may want to see them beaten to a pulp, but Yeslin was a lot trickier when it came to getting what she wanted. Though dangerous instances may be rare in comparison, it meant that when Yeslin needed help, things were already really bad. There was probably so much more than what they told her, but Cassandra understands that they have to do things to get by, and they're the sort of things they don't want her anywhere near. Over time, Cassandra found that the blue bugs seemed to respond to her. This took quite a long time to notice, but eventually, they weren't in her hair anymore. At times, a large group of them would rise up out of thin air, directly in front of her path, gathering en masse to the point where she would have to find another route through. On more than one occasion, she had even gotten lost, only to follow a path of beetles towards where she needed to go. Not back to their nest or back where she came from, but as though they understood her intentions and were doing their best to help. Such behavior didn't extend far beyond little bugs, though, and after the sun sets, there was nothing that could help. Everything about the forest was hostile at night, down to the scattered red vines that sought to expose anything unnatural to the forest that happened to stop for more than a moment. They illuminate when disturbed in places where the sun cannot reach them, and at night. They were also why cutting a path through wouldn't work. They're hard to see, and once severed, every attached section for 3 meters would instantly glow. Even if only for a moment, being exposed so clearly would draw out the worst kind of attention. With the light still piercing through the trees, this would be among the last chances she gets to be still until she reaches the other side of the forest. Squatting down to steady her breathing after her run, she closes her eyes to recall the events of that morning. Weslow reeked of alcohol, and there were some signs that he was recently in a fight. His shirt was torn, with a few dried brown bloodstains trailing down his chest. He had some fresh bruises around his eyes and lips, too. He got beat up, she whispers aloud. He's so fucking pathetic. It was a regular sight to see him in such a state, then taking his frustrations out on his family, but there were times when everything seemed fine. Yet her mother would send her away, sensing something must be off with Weslow. Those times were by far the worst. Her mother had to conceal her injuries with thick makeup or wear layers of clothing to hide the purple swelling from bruises. She never went anywhere to escape, but she would still put on a show as though Cassandra couldn't tell what was wrong. Even so, it would show in Catherine's movements during training. At times, she might only use one hand to fend off Cassandra's attacks, or she would forgo the quick steps she used to dodge, instead bearing down and pivoting as she blocked and parried. There was no way to comprehend it fully. Her mother had been training her in self-defense since the age of 4, and now, on the cusp of her 10th birthday, Cassandra knew that she herself possessed the strength enough to kill him. Her mother had no reason to endure such abuse. She could certainly overpower Weslow effortlessly. Shaking off her contemplation, Cassandra became acutely aware of the need to press on. There was nothing left for her back home. With renewed determination, she resumed her journey, knowing she had no more than a half an hour's time until she reached the outskirts of the slums. Finally, a glimmer of familiarity emerged, a small stream she had often crossed farther to the north. With a sense of relief, she decided to continue on in this direction. She estimates it would take only another 10 minutes to reach the city. However, as she crossed the stream and ventured no more than a few meters in, her heart sank. A fog was gathering at an alarming rate, and the sound of the stream completely disappeared. Even so, with an idea of the direction she has to go, she decides to press on. But once again, she found herself stopping before a thin line of beetles. She crouches down and whispers, "I'll deal with whatever it is. I'm in a hurry." At times, this would be plenty for them to allow her passage. She was aware that a possible danger lay ahead, but the morning had left her with little patience for finding a new path forward. "You're getting stronger with each passing day." Her mother's words rang through her mind, and it was enough for her to make her decision final. But more and more beetles gathered, piling on top of each other and raising several inches above the ground. Within a few minutes, there would be enough to completely block her path, so she takes the opportunity to hop over them, careful not to harm a single one. She meant to continue onwards, but realizes that her bag was no longer with her. Turning back, she sees it lying atop the mass of beetles. What's more, she hadn't dropped it at all. The strap that held it in place had been chewed through in the second it took for her to jump over them. I know you mean well and thank you, but really, I'll be all right. May I have my bag back? She reaches her hand for it, but the beetles retreat. Fine, she yells. Take it. But when I take the head of whatever stands in my way, you better give it back. And with that, she moves on, now running without a shred of caution. Her friends would be waiting for her, and that was all that mattered. Should she come face to face with this unknown danger, she would kill it. To Cassandra, it was as simple as that. Part 3. The Red Lake. Pressing past massive leaves and slipping through tightly packed trees, Cassandra's feet suddenly felt as though they had been kicked out from beneath her. She stumbles forward, all sense of equilibrium lost as she spills down an incline. She lands hard on her back, her head hitting hard against a stone that lay just beneath the mossy surface. Cassandra's head was still spinning as she stood up, the muscles in her back screaming at the effort. As her vision clears, Cassandra's mouth drops open in alarm. She was surrounded by a hazy white fog that poured out from within the very earth, parting to reveal a blood-red lake, stretching out into infinity. Sitting at the water's edge, their feet dangling below the surface, was a boy not much younger than Cassandra. An instinctual urge to call out a warning surged from within, but she immediately clamps both hands over her mouth, muffling any sound. She drops to her knees, keenly aware of the stillness that enveloped the water's surface. Something was terribly wrong. Ensuring she remained hidden, Cassandra maneuvered side to side, inch by inch, cautious not to disturb the individual vines beneath her feet for too long, until she found better cover. Minutes ticked by in eerie silence, and just as doubt started to seep into her thoughts, the piercing sound of a man's voice shattered the soundless void of her surroundings. It came from across the lake, so Cassandra took that moment to scramble over to the closest tree that could afford her a better and safer view. It didn't take long for the yelling to get closer, the fog seemingly guiding her sight, as the only clarity she could see across the lake was a single spot where before long a man, eyes wide with frenzy, appeared yelling, "Please, come back." The fog thickened around the boy at the lake's edge, but at the man's words, a new voice emerged. "I'm over here, Dad. Help me, I'm scared." Cassandra's mind reeled in fear. This wasn't right. The voice of the boy emerged through the fog, but the figure at the edge of the lake had still not moved at all. This was a trap, and it wasn't meant for Cassandra. The man, distraught as only a loving parent could be, sees the childlike figure, and his words of comfort come pouring out. This man wasn't Weslow. This was a good man. The water only rose to his waist, but halfway across, the man seemed to struggle. The mud had ripped the shoes off his feet, pulling him by force with every step he took. He stops for only a moment, his energy draining rapidly. He still calls to the child, still yelling words of comfort. "You'll never have to be scared again. I will get you home safe. I will save you." But he has stopped for too long, and now the vines within the water begin to emit a radiant light. The water begins to swirl around, and from within the whirl emerges the form of a woman, her body dripping the glowing red water of the pond as though it were part of her being. Cassandra was frozen, her eyes widening in alarm. She wanted to scream, but the sound was lost to her as the billowing white mist threatened to pull her in with its force. Within seconds, the fog had gathered into a sphere, surrounding the man and lifting him above the water to stand at equal height with the creature. Run! Every fiber of her being screamed at Cassandra, but she couldn't. The fear had its grip. Run! Again, the words tore through her mind, but it made no difference. The mist began to close in on the man, and his cries of distress filled Cassandra's ears. Clasping her hands over her ears did little to block out the sound, but it was enough to return a fraction of her senses. Looking down, she saw that the red vines had wrapped tightly around her left ankle and were beginning to glow with a light that filled her with dread. Panic surged through her, and her entire body trembled while the light continued to spread, as if to say, "You're next." She took the small knife off her leg and managed to quickly cut herself free, not caring in the slightest that she accidentally nicked herself in the process. Her last glance back came as a matter of instinct, and what she saw would stay with her for the rest of her life. The swirling fog had turned a deep red, and the man was no longer visible, except for one thing. The misty sphere lifted above the creature's form and burst, its arms raised as if welcoming the red mist, which rained down upon it, and in its hands it held the man's heart. Branches scratched at her face as she ran, and stones and vines made her stumble, but she kept going. The memories of what she had witnessed wouldn't stop replaying in her mind. The warmth of the man's voice calling for his child, the unsettling realization of the creature's true nature, the burst of red that stained the lake. These images flashed relentlessly, each one more vivid than the last. The man's face, contorted in pain, the creature's eyes reflecting a disturbing satisfaction, and the haunting image of the heart still beating. She didn't stop running until the trees around her returned to their familiar brown hues, signaling that the worst was behind her. She could feel the wetness on her face as she touched her cheek, but the sight of her own blood brought her back to that terrifying moment. The earthy smell of the lake, the glowing red vines, and now the blood on her hands, which she wasn't sure entirely belonged to her. Overwhelmed by the instinct to survive, she relaxed for only a moment before the memories came rushing back. Clenching her hand over her mouth, she couldn't stop her body's intense reaction. Nausea surged through her, forcing her to her knees. She tried to regain her breath, rolling on the ground, clutching at her throat, desperately trying to breathe. Her vision started to dim, but she had just enough awareness left to hear a voice calling out to her. "Kid, no. What happened to you?" Though the rest of the words faded away, Cassandra, with tears streaming down her face, managed a small smile before losing consciousness.